Let's now move on to our second session entitled Preparing for Carbon Neutrality by 2050. We will be having a presentation of a global trend and also listen to 3 countries' experiences. Same as session 1, the comprehensive discussion and Q&A session is prepared at the end of all the presentations. So our first speaker of session number 2 is Mr. Stefano Di Clara, the International Policy Director of International Emissions Trade Organizations. So the next 12 minutes is all yours.
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me and see me okay, and most fundamentally you can see the presentation. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks again to the organizers for the kind invitation. It's also great to know that at least some of you can be together in person, and yeah, it's great that these kind of hybrid events are becoming increasingly possible now. So as the presenter just said, I'll be giving you a quick overview of where we are with global trends for net zero commitments and for the role that carbon markets can play in meeting those commitments. Just as a brief note of introduction about myself and AITA. So I'm Director for International Policy at AITA, and AITA is a business organization of businesses from a wide range of different sectors and geographical locations that actively promote emissions trading and carbon markets as a way to put a price on CO2 emissions and as a way to meet environmental objectives. And so a lot of our work right now is around the topic of carbon markets in a net zero context. When we want to understand what are the current trends globally, I think there are a couple of different levels that we should look at. And it's more than a couple, I think it's at least 4 different levels that we need to consider in the discussion. And I think they are fairly well represented in this slide. So the first level we need to look at is obviously the long-term goal that we have to reach, which is outlined by the Paris Agreement and by IPCC science, and that would be the 1.5 degree goal, which would mean reaching net zero around mid-century. Then again, the second level worth looking at, and that starts to be a reality check against this long-term goal, is the commitments that countries are putting forward to meet that long-term objectives, and these are the net zero commitments that we're starting to see. Then again, one level down, we need to look at what are the targets and commitments that are expressed in the nationally determined contributions that parties are putting forward to the Paris Agreement. And so these are the shorter term targets on the way to the long-term target. And then possibly the most important level that we should consider is what are the actual policies and the measures that are underpinning those commitments. And this is, and on this slide, you see how those different levels relate to each other and where what we have right now would take us in terms of the temperature goal. So again, starting from the first level, I think by now it's clear to everyone what we need to do, when and how, and what we need to get to as a final goal. Which is, again, reaching a balance between emissions and removals around mid-century. To get there, we mainly have to drastically reduce emissions, and drastic reductions are especially needed in the coming decade. And as we reduce emissions, we also need to start scaling up removals and carbon capture opportunities to get really to a situation where those sink of emissions can balance out any leftover emissions we'll have towards 2050. Again, there are countries that are putting forward commitments to get to net zero by 2050 or around 2050 in some cases. And if we look at what is on the table right now, we see that some countries already achieved net zero emissions, mainly thanks to particular circumstances that they have. And then a big number of countries actually have net zero commitments right now, or are developing net zero commitments, but these commitments are in different basically stages of being expressed. Some are already in legislation, meaning that they are binding commitments. Some are being proposed in legislation. Some are in policy documents, and many others are under development, for a total of around 124 commitments, which, if we look comprehensively where those will take us, we see that they cover a significant amount of global emissions, global GDP, and global population. But again, the next level that we need to consider is how those long-term commitments relate with the shorter-term commitments that parties are taking. And in that sense, it's worth looking at what countries are putting forward in their nationally determined contributions towards the Paris Agreement. So these, in most cases, are the 2030 targets, so to speak. So the shorter term targets on the way to the long term objective. And if we look at to what extent countries are raising ambition as part of that process, we get a bit more of a mixed picture in a way, where some parties are increasing their ambition compared to the previous round of NDCs, while others are not necessarily increasing the shorter term targets. And moving one level down again, I think it's also worth considering what are the policies that are being implemented around the world to basically underpin and facilitate meeting those environmental objectives. And as we all know, one of the most common forms of climate policy is carbon pricing. So policies that generate a price on CO2 emissions. And looking at this map, which shows both carbon taxes and emission trading systems under development or already in operation around the world, we start to get a picture of what countries are actually doing to deliver on those commitments. And as you can see, carbon pricing is really starting to emerge in every continent, and it is becoming one or the main policy tool to regulate and reduce emissions. At present, we have a total of 64 carbon pricing initiatives around the world, which cover somewhere around or just below 25% of the global GHG emissions. One thing that is interesting and worth noting is that there is a really rapid uptake of these policies in the last few years, and there is a trend that is reinforcing this rapid uptake. So I think if we come back to this map 4 or 5 years from now, we are likely to see an even bigger number of carbon pricing initiatives around the world. Looking a bit more closely at what is the global outlook for carbon markets, we basically get a similar picture as for carbon pricing overall. So countries across almost all continents are either already implementing or thinking about the implementation of domestic or regional emission trading systems. And we've also seen this trend rapidly increasing in the over the last few years. So at present, we have 24 operational carbon markets around the world, plus 8 under development, and these cover around 60% of global GHG emissions. And again, as you can see from this slide, it is a trend that has been rapidly increasing in the last few years. The big increase in coverage compared to 2020, both in terms of carbon pricing overall and carbon markets, has been determined by the launch of the national emission trading system in China. And Min will dive into that later on this panel. The last dimension that I want to look at has to do with how then carbon pricing policies and especially carbon markets can be used in the international context. And here again, we see that a lot of countries are mentioning the intention to use international markets as a way to meet their NDC commitments. The map is slightly outdated, but if you see what the latest NDC synthesis report says, and that is a document that the UNFCCC has released last year, we see that as part of the new round of NDC submissions, there is an increasing number of them that are looking at the use of Article 6 and international markets under the Paris Agreement. And Article 6 can be, by creating a framework for international markets under the Paris Agreement, can be a significant tool to both reduce the cost of meeting the NDC commitments, and can also be a way to increase ambition over time. So it could be a way to start closing that gap between where the current commitments will take us and the actual long-term objective of the Paris Agreement. And my last slide will give you a sense of what countries are doing already right now in terms of implementation of international market approaches under Article 6. We all know that the Article 6 rules and guidance is expected to be adopted at COP26 at the end of this year in Glasgow. But it's also worth noting that ahead of that step, a lot of countries are already moving on implementing international market approaches under the Paris Agreement. So I'll stop it here, and I'm more than happy to hand over the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Stefano De Clara. You have been sharing with us your insights through the global trend, and you specifically provided the context regarding the key components of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and also the economic and mitigating the potential. Thank you very much once again. And next, we have Mr. Alistair Rich, the Director of Asia Pacific Sustainability, Asia Society Policy Institute, with his presentation about the UK. Mr. Rich, please, the next 12 minutes is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be speaking at the International Greenhouse Gas Conference, focusing on low emission development to achieve carbon neutrality and SDGs. So my talk will be looking at the UK case study, UK net zero target and strategy for 2050. I'll be going into detail on the target itself in terms of the carbon budgets that make up that target, and the strategy, particularly looking at the key elements of the approach, the types of abatement that would be needed in the UK, and the associated policies and measures, as well as the cost impacts, both the investment costs and cost savings, as well as finally giving you some conclusions on some of the key points. So in terms of the UK net zero goals, these, as Stefano mentioned, these are established in legislation. So the Climate Change Act legislates for the UK's long-term targets. So these were established in legislation in 2019. The approach to get there is through 5-year carbon budgets. So this slide shows the budgets 1 to 6. The 6th budget was just recently developed and is due to be legislated quite shortly. So these act as stepping stones to achieve the long-term target. The budgets are proposed by the Committee on Climate Change based on evidence and assessment of costs and benefits. The 6th carbon budget is covering the period 2033 to 2037, and this is resulting in a 78% reduction in GHG by 2023 from 1990 levels. So this slide here shows the progress against the carbon budgets as well as the projected performance. So this information is taken from the government's updated energy projections. This is the latest version of their projections. And in the dark blue, it shows the carbon budget levels, going from carbon budgets 1, 2, 3, 4 to 5. And in the light blue, it shows for budgets 1 to 2, which have now passed, it shows actual performance. And this is showing that these were complied with. For the 3rd budget, which we're currently in, we're expected to be on track. But for the 4th and 5th budgets, the projections are showing that we're likely to be off track. These projections are showing some uncertainty band. It's a 95% confidence interval. And they include all of the policies that are implemented, adopted and planned by 2019 in these updated projections. So the message from this slide is that the policies currently, as of 2019, were not adequate to achieve the 4th and 5th carbon budgets. The majority of the emissions in these projections are actually from non-traded sectors. So this has been an area of key focus for the UK. This slide here shows the performance up to around 2018 in emissions reductions by sector. And the main message from this picture is that the power sector has achieved significant reductions in the UK, driven a lot by the carbon price. So Stefano was mentioning about the importance of carbon pricing as a key policy to achieve net zero, and the UK has already seen the benefits of this, not only through the EU ETS carbon price, but a carbon price floor as well that was introduced. There's been significant switch from coal to gas and also to renewables. So the UK has also invested a lot in offshore wind, for example, and other renewable policies. But the other message from this slide is that for many sectors, there's been very little progress, if at all. So particularly transport, homes and agriculture, emissions are largely unchanged over this time period. So the key elements of the approach in the UK is the Climate Change Act itself. This anchors everything in the legislation. The legislation is quite detailed and it sets out the roles and responsibilities for different organisations. It provides the basic framework, which is evidence-based carbon budgets, and it requires near-term action, i.e. policies and measures to achieve those budgets. So this is quite a simple but helpful summary of the UK approach in terms of, number 1, the goal, the 2050 target, number 2, the pathway through the carbon budgets, number 3, the toolkit, which is the requirement the government brings forward policies, number 4, the monitoring framework. So the Committee on Climate Change, as well as doing a lot of the work to propose the carbon budgets, is also responsible for monitoring progress and suggesting changes. And a key advantage of the UK approach is that the Committee on Climate Change is independent. Whilst it has a role within government, it's able to provide independent advice and it's actually quite challenging and ambitious in its approach. So this slide simply shows I guess the reference year for the UK commitments, 1990, and the progress up to 2018, and then what's required up to 2050. The key message here is that progress needs to be accelerated. Also, there has been quite a big reduction up to 2018, almost 50%. The speed of progress needs to be accelerated. And actually that's combined with perhaps more difficult reductions to make. Some of the reductions in the power sector in the UK were relatively easy, but for other sectors this will be more challenging. And this slide shows the analysis from the work for the 6th carbon budget, and it breaks down the different types of abatement that would be needed to achieve net zero by 2050. So the top two colours, the purple and pink, represent reductions from reducing demand from carbon-intensive activities, and also improving energy efficiency. This is about 15% of the total reduction is from reducing demand. The next portion is in the kind of orange and the orangey colours, orange and yellow. This is the take-up of low-carbon solutions. This is over 50% of the reduction required. This will be vehicles, boilers, also for industry in terms of electrification and moving to hydrogen, as well as CCS. The third segment is in terms of expanding low-carbon energy supply, both electricity and hydrogen. And then the final element is in land and removals. So this slide is interesting because it shows the economic assessment of the net zero goals, and above the top portion of this is showing the investment costs, which were expressed as annualized costs. And from 2030, the investment costs on an annual basis should be around £50 billion per year. This will be mostly investment in low carbon power, retrofitting buildings, electric vehicle batteries and infrastructure. And these costs are realistic to be financed if the policies give sufficient long-term clarity to consumers and confidence to investors. Below the bottom portion of the diagram shows the cost savings. So these are savings in fuel costs due to more efficient solutions. And in the later years of this period, the savings offset the investment costs. The net annualized resource cost is less than 1% of GDP up to 2050. And this estimate in the latest work from Committee on Climate Change is actually reduced from even their work in 2019. This is because they've done more detailed modelling, and also the cost of low carbon technologies is coming down. And another key point to note is that whilst there is an impact on GDP of these investments, there's also a positive impact on GDP of the amount of resources that can be freed up that can be used elsewhere. So there's actually expected to be a net increase in GDP by 2035 of 2% because of these resources directed away from fossil fuel imports to UK investment. This slide, I won't go through all of the detail here, but this shows the sequence of the route to 2050 net zero. It shows the different segments of the pathway. Firstly, work before COP26. This is including legislating the 6th carbon budget, updating the NDC, developing a comprehensive net zero strategy, as well as finalising strategies for energy, heat and buildings, carbon pricing, transport, industrial, hydrogen, etc. And then by 2024, there's significant progress across all sectors required. Scale up from mid-2020s to 2030, roll out 2030 to 2050, and then net zero. Then a lot of this detail is expressed in the following slide by sector. So in terms of surface transport, key priorities will be to phase out new sales of petrol, diesel cars, heavy duty vehicles. There'll be focused on recharging and refueling infrastructure, policies to reduce travel demand. For industry, transition support framework to help industry stay competitive. Internationally, they'll be focused on border carbon tariffs and other carbon standards. For buildings, there's a lot of work to phase out fossil heating, as well as various standards around energy efficiency, etc. For electricity generation, further work to scale up renewable investment, overcoming barriers to major scale up, particularly connections for offshore wind. There's also coal phase out will happen in 2024, and then there'll be gas-fired power station phase out by 2030, particularly gas without CCS. And there's a lot of work in the power sector to accelerate the need to accommodate flexibility of the new types of power, as well as a low carbon hydrogen strategy. And then finally, just to sum up, to reach a net zero target, it requires a process, a sequence, a governance system, including legislation, the right organizations. The presentation here shows what types of measures will be needed. In the early years, there's a focus on scaling up policies, ramping up supply chains for low carbon goods, and addressing sectors that have made very little progress so far. The sales of most high carbon goods will be phased out altogether by early 2030s. There's a critical focus, a critical need in the UK for the government to scale up its policy to encourage business and to invest and engage with the people in the challenge. So it's all very well having the targets, but actually delivering this is going to be a big challenge for the UK. Significant progress has already happened due to the power sector, as I said. This remains a challenge for many other countries that have yet to address the power sector and yet to make effective carbon pricing work in the power sector. The UK's process and governance system can be a good example, although the detailed transferability of its policy measures will be quite country specific. And the UK's profile of emissions is quite different, I guess, to many countries in Asia. But I think certainly a key message is that the economic impact is not that significant, and it would even be beneficial because of cost savings outweighing the resource costs. But one of the prerequisites for this is long-term planning, long-term certainty for business and people. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and that's the end of my presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Alistair Rich, for your very interesting presentation on UK. The significant achievement of UK will inspire other countries to do so as well. So thank you very much once again. And moving on, we have Ms. Min Li, the China representative of International Emissions Trading Association, who will give a presentation about China. Ms. Li, please, the next 12 minutes, it's yours.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to join this event. And I'm also really happy to share a bit about what is actually happening in China. And I think I'm really lucky to have Stefano, my colleague, has already introduced what AITA is. So you won't see that in my slides. So everything in my slides will be focusing on China and what we're heading for and what when try to nail it down and the challenges we are facing. And we try to do our best and with all the helps we can get. So therefore, I will start with what really we've been heard about, like the intention, how we, as the largest developing countries, addressing to achieve carbon CO2 emission peak, and also eternally to take the shortest time to reach carbon neutrality. It's all, we emphasize this self-motivated and self-driven due to a lot of factors, and one clearly we can see is caused and by the natural disasters and its frequency and also its damage to the society and also to what we could already see the extreme weather and extreme conditions happening in a more frequent sequence. And as we could see in the first slide, these are the statistics and showing the natural disasters as causing a significant financial loss and also casualty in China in the past years. And although the data is a little bit like still 2018, that the financial figure is very significant, accounting to like 257 billion. And I'm sure we are trying to really hard to reduce this amount, but we can see a little bit joking about what we do have a little bit old normal back this spring is we do have some sandstorm again this spring, despite we still have, pandemic is going on, but we are still coping with these conditions. And let's go to the next slide. Happily and luckily, I think we have received a lot of high-level attention and to address climate change, and eventually to nail down our national determined contribution to a more ambitious level. After our president has officially announced our 2030 carbon peaking goal and also 2060 carbon neutrality goal, it has caused a chain reaction to the whole society. I'm really happy, like since I'm joining this area since 2004, in my first job, and we are working really hard on this, and could see most of the progress is in the recent years. And yeah, so it's already a good sign, good beginning. And what are the highlights and takeaway from the this year's 14th year plan, which we're going to finally approved by our National People's Congress this March. And it is officially addressed certain clauses on climate change and also on carbon market and also action plan, how to pick CO2 emission and really to develop and draft the national task forces on peak CO2 emission and also to reach carbon neutrality. And it is high on the not only political agenda, but also in the agenda of all the relevant sectors and aspects, work lives. And a quick wrap up of the pathway, how we have been gradually move on to enhance the set target, which is like in 2000 during Paris Agreement, which we have been finalized the CO2 emission intensity target and also energy consumption target, and it is actually a large portion increase compared to the previous Copenhagen announcement. And although it's still not ambitious, but we do hope like our a little bit more ambitious targets set last year, which we're going to achieve in 2030 and 2060, will be more reflect the reality and also will be the real driven of the whole national system to restructure the industry sector, structural, and also our economic model. And well, let's go to another catch up about like why we still could see the actual target is setting in that specific range with why we still have like carbon intensity target instead of absolute absolute linear reduction target. Well, due to the first reality and fact is like our economy is still developing, so we're still a developing country, and just give a little bit slide of time period to reach peak of the CO2 emission. That is kind of to give a break and hopefully to hold a little bit, to hold the unhealthy economic development mode and path, and until we reach the peak, so we can eventually turn down and also to mute and also to really reach the neutrality timeline. Unless we are trying to target in like although the target sets like from after 2030 to 60, so we do have a 30 years time length to turning to reach carbon neutrality. But what has been, we have been also working and developing and trying really hard by our the whole system, and try to reach a CO2 peak emission earlier than 2030s in order to gain more time to reach carbon neutrality. So that is still we need to crack down all the headbones out of those major challenges as developing speed and model, and also the unbalance our social economic structures, and the way it is, as mentioned, is core. We need to change the core, and also to have change fundamental restructuring of the systems, and also have a lot of innovation in our core and those conventional energy sectors, and also these issues have been addressed since the founding of our country. New system, and really to achieve a faster, quicker, and with higher quality of transition or transformation of the whole structure in less than 30 years. And till now, since really have the announcement, the 2030 and 2060 goals are the whole it has been aroused a lot of discussions, and also researches, and also domestic and also international collaborations on research, and also study on possible pathway for China to achieve carbon neutrality, and how to really address those challenges with possible quality change, and also adaptation and evolving of the current systems, starting with setting the national target and enhance the national target in our the 14th five-year plan, also to the 15th five-year plan, which is running from this year on till 2030. That is essentially the time we should peak our CO2 emission, only CO2 emission, remember. And then secondly, and we will have to optimize any restructuring all the industrial systems, and as also we've been also heard from our UK experiences, also other developed countries' experiences. This is crucial, and also it's really the most challengeable sectors to address, and also to transform in the energy system. And just to highlight a few already formulated results or estimation how much when renewables we really need to install and have in our energy supply system, and for wind and solar and hydro need to increase more than 25%, and this although it's new target by 25, but the actual recommendation from our experts, and also are striving for 25 to 30 of renewables in our energy system, and for a little bit how much a clean energy should be eventually included and provide to our energy structure by end of 2030. That is essential to achieve the carbon emission peak. And then we do need to address all those transformation, we do need a lot of innovation and also adaptation in new technologies or innovative technologies. And because we are definitely stepping into a new era. And we're sure we are addressing and we're being a test ground for a lot of new stuff like AI and also digitalization of a lot of stuff. Even we can draw to the pandemic experience. But we really need to use and apply those renovated methodology more soundly in addressing climate change. And finally, what we've been talking about those challenges and need to address and to change the system and specifically how to evolve the market and especially to leverage fund. We do have the latest outcoming of the missing fund is to reach carbon at least to reach carbon peak and also toward shifting to carbon neutrality. We do need at least 100 trillion RMB for that close that gap. That is the the funding gap. And these are also need a market-driven solution, and how that being could be really applied and involve all the relevant sectors to motivate it. And just also a little bit how much like we have been doing and where we are, and the challenge in order to better solve and address those challenges. And we do, like as mentioned in our policy development in the structures, we do have a remarkably increase in addressing climate change and regulating climate change stuff in our 30th five-year plan, also running, I think, from now forward, will mention a lot of things and regulating and to approving and speed up the process and adaptation of the process for climate governance, climate legislation, starting domestically and also actively, as we could notice, participating in international climate governance. And then we do, by end of this year, we will see how our the action plan for the national action plan to peak CO2 emission will be finally compiled and released to the public. So we could clearly see, as right now, all the provincial governments and also high and key sectors are working and also formulating, drafting their action plan to peak CO2 emission in their province and also in their sector of industries, or in the as a leading entities in their background. And for as we also do, if you follow what has been developing in China, we have not only pilots in emission trading, but also we do have a lot of pilots in low carbon development and also low carbon communities. These are as another parallel development national tasks or ongoing process since 2015. And we do have like as the latest research has been shown by Energy Foundation, we do have another pilot is for cities to pilot to reach a carbon emission peak. And as like Beijing, a few cities and province like Jiangsu has already reached their peak, but which has represent like 40% of our emission, and another 40% of the GHG emission in China could actually, with a kind of positive estimation, could reach their peak by 2025. So the rest 20 will be a bit challenging, but we're still targeting to reach peak of CO2 emission earlier than 2030. So these also due to a lot of public awareness enhancing and also promotion. And in the next few slides is a demonstration of the key entities in our power sectors. The entities not only SOEs, but also private sectors as well. So their actions and also their commitment to either draft or already announce their pathway and timeline to reach peak, and also turn and transit to carbon neutrality. So as we could see, the one of the leading national energy group, National Electricity Investment Group, they are the first one to announce to reach their carbon peak in 2023, which is a good example. And that's a good example. And yeah, I'm not going through all of them, just a little bit demonstration about how like it's a time order. So after the announcement of president of the two neutrality and peak goals, and how those leading enterprises and also has been taking into reaction and how much they have been committed so far. So there's not only in the energy sectors, almost covering every sectors. And also this slide is, well, as we probably will represent the most acceptable or most likely pathway or methodology how China we could eventually meet carbon neutrality earlier than 2060. So this is, I think you are the experts and most could really see how much gap we have to first reach our emission peak, CO2 peak, and then to neutral the part in different ways, as being explained in and also demonstrating different colors. And for the conventional sectors, energy and also intensified targets or sectors, mostly is energy efficiency and also and introduce renewable energy, as in like construction, transportation, and industries, and to really to decarbonizing the power generation sectors and introduce new energies or renewable energies or energy or renovate in power generation or source like hydrogen has also been introduced. It is also has went through a lot of researches in our power groups and also has already introduced in certain pilot demonstration projects by them. And then for the end users also, we also need to really change the conventional consumption style to a more greener consumption style. And this is also has been highly introduced to all the household. And yeah, then we do have a little bit like what also need to address carbon sink and to use CCUS, and it's as what I've been more tested and also has been demonstrated in several areas in China. So I'm going to, well, it's yes, it really is to transform the whole system. We have been worked a lot on the possible structures of the systems, the governance systems, and to nail things down from central to local. And for the covered entities or for companies, and you could clearly see where you are and how for you as a province or as a company or as a group or a private sector or as an individual, how you could be involved in the system and how the structure is try to really work out and through the managerial structure. So I think you will see all these graphs, and that just demonstration how it works. And especially for covered entities, you like it's also a parallel system in what has been we are been working on another national ETS. So carbon neutrality, well, in our system is more head and lead by National Emission Development and Reform Commission. And for ETS, it's more by our Ministry of Ecology and Environment. So that is in another parallel system. But overall, our NDRC is overwatching in all the national task forces to reach carbon emission peak and also carbon neutrality. So these are the combination of the two systems. And eventually, I'm also like address a little bit more how the real motivation will come from is how it is all the fund has been, could be originated and how it will affect and also interact with the market. And we have been I think by end of last month in April, our Ministry of Finance, together with other non-ministries, has released the new management measures on how to manage green finance or climate finance. And it is totally in consideration of how our financial sectors and also the public fund of sourcing could contribute and to the whole national strategy to achieve carbon neutrality in the earlier time, and also to have interaction and integrate the existing ETS pilots and also to magnify the function and also the effect of the national ETS, which we are expecting we are going to should have our online training by hopefully by end, but also as earlier as possible in next month, which is in June. And well, they have all the relevant like governing policies and regulations, management measures, all the needed legislation documents available and the supporting systems available, platforms and registries, all that has been said. And for the financing sector, we have all the conventional exchange and trading houses are open and also introduce new areas of business to have like carbon future considered and will be integrated. And we do have also a new future exchange funded, which is what more specifically serve to possible financial products like green bond funds available in the future financial market. And in this, we'll definitely start testing carbon futures and also start with carbon EDS trading market. And I think, I would like to stop here. And if you have any further questions, we can go through, have more discussions. But I think I stop here. Happy to share.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Lin, for your interesting talk on how China's doing with the strategies that they're implementing and to achieve the carbon peak and also the carbon neutrality. Yes, for the questions, we will be dealing them at the Q&A session at the end of all the presentations. So for the last presentation, we have Professor Seung-Jik Yoo from Sookmyung University, who will give his presentation about Korea titled Carbon Neutrality by 2050 in Korea. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
예, 안녕하세요. 숙명여자대학교의 유승직입니다. 저는 오늘 이
Hello
자리에
everyone,
소개된
I am
것이
Yoo Seung-jik from
한편으로는 저
Sookmyung
개인에게
University.
영광이지만 또
It is
감회가
my great honor
저희가
to be
2012년인가
here.
13년에 이
And in
자리에서
2012, I believe it was also in 2013, that I actually was invited as a panelist to discuss about the future road ahead for South Korea in terms of carbon emissions. And now I'm standing in front of you to give a presentation about the Korean carbon neutrality plans. So in that sense, I am very overwhelmed and honored. Today, I'm going to talk about Korea's national greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, followed by our plans for 2050. Korea declared to become a carbon neutral state by 2050, so I would like to also share with you the Green New Deal, which will help us accelerate towards this transition. In order to attain carbon neutrality, we have many challenges ahead of us, and that is what I'm going to talk about on my third point. As you may well know, we actually defined the emissions target in 2012, but we have not yet achieved our target. However, throughout the years, Korea has made a lot of institutional arrangements that are serving as an example to many countries around the world. So in 2012, we implemented a target management system as well as emission trading system in 2015. As for the ETS, what was important was to secure quality data. So before even implementing the ETS, that is why we implemented a target management scheme since 2012. In implementing the TMS, so from 2012 to 2014, we collected all the emissions data from the companies and institutions, and we built on that set of data to implement a quality emission trading scheme. So we can proudly say that the ETS system in Korea is operational in a very stable manner. in 2015, 2017, 2019, and we had goals for 2030. We declared our goals along the way, and you can see the 3-year plans that were already announced, and also the plans by sector in detail. So we have plans for everything. But as it was mentioned by the speaker before, we have actually submitted an updated NDC last year. Actually, the NDC that we submitted last year is the NDC goal of the past. But this year, the government has upgraded and the NDC, and actually it announced that it's going to upgrade and raise its NDC and then submit it by the end of this year. So this is to reduce 24.4% compared to 2017. So it's going to be quite an aggressive and ambitious goal. As mentioned earlier on, ETS has played a very important role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Korea. Let me elaborate further on these roles. So in the beginning, it helped to reduce 40 to 50% of global of the greenhouse gas emissions. So you can say that we made a comparison between the ETS emission compared to the national emission, and the overall percentage is about 70%, which attests to the fact that ETS played a very important role in reducing the national greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of permit prices, so if we look to EU, after implementing the ETS, it had a lot of trials and errors, and there was also an economic downturn. So there were lots of fluctuations regarding permit prices. But as for Korea, you can see there has been an increasing trend of permit prices. Well, that is quite natural because if we continue to emit, the price goes up, and there are more trading, and the price goes up. So it has now risen to 40,000 Korean won, so the daily permit prices. But with COVID-19 outbreak, from May 2020, it has fallen to 12,000 won or 10,000 won. We have published a report dating back in 2018, so which involves the second ETS phase. So you can see that the certified emissions are lower than final allocation. So you can say that the companies have successfully met the allocations. So if the businesses fail to meet the emissions requirement, then there is a reporting system that the businesses have to go through. So in terms of implementation rate, you can see it has reached 90% and these days up to 100%. So the business are collaborating very thoroughly on this system. And for every system, in its initial years, it goes through trials and errors. But you can see that the permit prices have steadily increased since 2015, and you can see that the market has also been formed stably. Now I'm going to talk briefly about Korea's Green New Deal. So with the economic crisis or economies hard hit by COVID-19, Korea was no exception. In 2018 and 2009, when we faced when other countries faced economic downturn, there were always new deals that were launched to overcome the obstacle. So for this crisis, Korea also launched Green New Deal, which consists of low-carbon environmental friendly change and drastic investment reform. So one of the core initiatives of this Green New Deal is to promote investments in infrastructure. So you can say that the deal involves 8 projects in 3 fields. So basically, it is to transform the social structure, and secondly, it is to move towards and transition towards renewable energy and reduce the use of coal. And third, seek innovation in the green industry. So these are the main 3 pillars supporting the Green New Deal.
한국의 그린 뉴딜의 기본적인 방향이라고 보겠습니다.
At the end of last year, Korea also launched a long-term 2050 vision. So the Republic of Korea will achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, and to achieve that goal, green innovations and advanced digital technologies should be harnessed. Furthermore, energy efficiency should be promoted, energy consumption decreased, and if not, we have to be able to complement the excess demand with renewables. And when we cannot actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, like in the cement sector, we have to explore carbon sinks or other carbon storage instruments. So this is a scenario development which tells us that we have a long way ahead of us. So I also looked at the Germany's case. So it actually reduced about 1% of emissions in 30 years. But if you look at what Korea has presented, so the comparison between 2017 versus 2030, you can say that we expect about minus 2.1% growth. And we have to reduce more than minus 11%. You also saw the case of Germany. So it has actually achieved on average minus 7%. It has to achieve minus 7% on an yearly basis going forward. So it seems like the case will be similar for Korea. We have to achieve minus 7.7% of greenhouse gas emissions, and that means we have to reduce 250 million tons of CO2 going forward until 2050. In order to achieve the set goals, we need a very systematic assessment of the implementation of our goals. We also need relevant policies, institutional arrangements, and monitoring and evaluation of the policies being implemented. Other than that, we also need to ensure the consistency among different government policies. It is also important to consider climate change impact in all policymaking decisions, and we should be able to provide incentives to businesses through carbon pricing. The carbon pricing system is being implemented through ETS, but we also have to think about adopting a carbon tax and other initiatives. The 30% of the emissions produced in Korea are in the electricity sector or electricity generation sector. But there's not much pass-through happening from the electricity tariffs, electricity production costs to the residential units. So you can say that the inflation rates and electricity prices increased respectively by 273% and 49.4% between 1982 and 2015. And electrification actually implies efficient use of energy. So we need to rationalize electricity prices or tariffs. This is the installed capacity, past and future, by fuel type. So you can see that according to the basic plan for electricity supply and demand of the Korean government, the installed capacity will increase by threefold or fourfold for renewables, because there's going to be a drastic decrease in number of coal-fired plants. So all of these are measures, but not enough to achieve our 2050 goal. But this is the right direction for us to take. As I said earlier on, government announced that it's going to develop scenarios to net zeros by 2050 in the first half of this year. And then in 2021, for the remaining year, it's going to develop the strategy by sector. Especially fuel switching in power generation is essential. How are we going to reflect the carbon price, and how are we going to pass through the carbon price to retail prices? This is a very important task to address. So the ETS is very important in terms of implementing carbon pricing system, but at the current level, it is highly likely that the carbon price will go up. So that is why we have to prepare relevant institutional arrangements. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Yu, for sharing your insights. Well, of course, there will be lots of obstacles along the way in order for us to achieve the goals. But with the concrete planning and strategies, we will be able to sort our way out. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will be beginning our second session's discussion session. We will be having the discussion for 30 minutes, and we will be joining by the moderator, the panelists, and the speakers of the second session. And let me first call upon the stage who are on site with us, Director Ji-hae-jo and Professor Seung-jik Yu, to join us on stage. Thank you very much for joining us on site. And of course, we have connected online to join us for this panel discussion. We have the moderator, Mr. William Ackworth, the head of Secretariat International Carbon Action Partnership, and also our two panelists, Ms. Tae-yeora, Director General of Integrated Assessment of Climate and Air Pollution, Korea Environment Institute, Ms. Ji-hae-jo, the Director, Senior Research Fellow of Resource Circulation Policy, Biomass Strategy, Waste to Energy, Korea Energy and Environment Institute, and also all the speakers of the second session, including Professor Seung-jik Yu on site. So let me now pass the microphone to Mr. William Ackworth to proceed with the session.
Well, good morning, everybody. So many thanks to all of our speakers for those excellent presentations. I think they've set the stage perfectly for a great discussion now. My name is William Ackworth. I'm the head of the International Carbon Action Partnership Secretariat. And for anybody that does not know, ICAP is a intergovernmental partnership for jurisdictions that have implemented or are pursuing mandatory emission trading systems. So before we get into some questions with the speakers, I would like to turn to our two panelists to get their reflections on the input presentations that we've heard, and also on this sort of topic at large of the net zero transition. So first, Ms. Tae-yeora, I would like to turn to you to get your reflections as our first panelist.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon. I'm Yeora Tae. I'm working at Korea Environment Institute. If you allow me, I'd like to share my short presentation to enhance communication. So I'd like to add a few comments or points for the economics of net zero or climate change. So many speakers, or three speakers today already mentioned how to achieve net zero. And some speakers mentioned of the cost of reduce GHGs. So one of the main obstacles to reduce GHG and achieving net zero is the cost. So I'd like to add a few 8 points about the economics of climate change impacts. What is going to happen if we don't reduce GHGs in the future? Next. So today we are presenting many risks. Yep, there are climate change is not the only risk. So World Economic Forum annually reported what is the most significant risk we are facing. So year 2021, they still report one of the top risks as climate action failure. So infectious disease is the next. The risk is as high as infectious disease. And climate change risk is already happened and it observed in many parts of the world. So socioeconomic impacts of climate change is already manifesting and affects all geographies. We already experienced some heat waves, so year 2003 European heat wave, year 2019, and some flood, and the Hurricane Sandy. And all these extreme weather events caused the damage in socioeconomic ways. And many scientists expect it is going to be more frequent and more intense in the future. And the damage and the cost will be huge in the future if we don't do nothing. Next. And I compared the risk of climate change and pandemic in economic ways. So the left figure shows the GDP loss due to pandemic in last year, and right figure shows the economic loss from climate change and air pollution for these scenarios. So if you, as you can see, the last year's pandemic, the GDP loss is something like 5 to 10%. In severe case like Peru and Spain, they lose GDP like 10%. But for climate change, for OECD countries, is the GDP loss is until year 2050, something like 2%, but it's going to be bigger as we go to year 2100. In some parts of the world, like Africa or Asia, some parts of the developing countries, the economic loss from climate change damage is something like 4% by year annually. Next. So one of the ways to compare the cost and benefits of carbon reduction, GHG reduction, is to put a value for the impacts. The social cost of carbon is the damage caused by extra ton of carbon emitted into the atmosphere. So many countries and many researchers estimated the social cost of carbon using many integrated assessment model. So the value is something like 60 or some, and the value is depending on how many sectors are included, whether the damage is in this on one country is included or whether which is social discount rate has been used. Yeah, so still uncertain, but yeah, you can use this value to compare the cost of GHG reduction, the carbon pricing. Next. And the social cost of carbon is not the static value. So if we don't do nothing and there are more carbon in the atmosphere and the temperature will rise and the extra ton of carbon will cause more damage in the future. Next. So we are facing what is going to happen in the future. So how do we behave in the future? Whether do we do no action? So, and many countries already submitted NDCs. We continue to reduce the GHG emission like indices, and 2 degrees centigrade stabilization or net zero. Next. And all scenarios will cause different climate change damage. This graph shows the Korean result. So if we follow the no action, so the climate change damage will be more than 4% in year 2100, while the net zero emission scenario will reduce the damage under 1% of GDP. Next. And these figures shows the importance of net zero compared to 2 degrees centigrade stabilization. So as we all know, the Paris Agreement is about the temperature stabilization below 2 degrees centigrade. So these are comparison of two scenarios. So as the left hand figure shows the result for 2050, and the green one shows 2100. So if you compare these two figures, the annual damage of 2 degree and 1.5 is not that huge. However, still under the 2 degree scenarios, there are the possibility of a higher damage cost occur in the future. So the distribution of cumulative damage cost in Korea, the net zero can significantly decrease the extreme damage of climate change compared to 2 degrees centigrade stabilization. That's why all countries join the Paris Agreement and to make effort to net zero emissions by 2050. Next. So way to net zero. So we need further action to reduce GHG emissions in consideration of damage cost, and especially the likelihood or probability of a higher damage cost occur in the future. So, and this is not enough. So 2 degrees centigrade is not enough. So we have to achieve the net zero to reduce higher damage costs in the future. So, and the cost of damage of no action will be higher than the cost of reduced GHG emissions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yoroshe. And I would now like to invite our other panelists, Ms. Jehijo, to also provide your remarks. I believe you'll do so from the podium.
Hello, I am Cho Ji-hye from KEI. Now, today I would like to tell you about the progress of the circular economy for carbon neutrality in Korea. Now, we understand that circular economy is getting a lot of attention for carbon neutrality. Now, unlike the linear economy where we would extract a lot, consume a lot, and produce a lot, now in this case, it is bound to create a lot of waste, meaning that it is bound to create a lot of environmental issues. But then for the circular economy, this stands in contrast to the linear economy. So this is where we try to minimize the consumption and waste generation of resources from before production, so before the waste is generated, so that we will be able to encourage reuse and remanufacturing so that the product life cycle can be extended. And also through the recycling, and also we can reuse the recycled materials, and by doing so we can also reduce the landfill and incineration, meaning that we can also help reduce the GHG emission. Now, in the case of Korea, for the waste management, the most GHG emission occurs from landfill, wastewater, and incineration. And out of them, landfill and incineration take up over 90% of the total GHG emission. And more recently, we see that the emission from waste is increasing. So in order to achieve the 2030 goals as well as the 2050 carbon neutrality, this means that we have to be more active in trying to reduce the emissions. Now, overall, the process of extracting and processing resources is causing about 50% of the global GHG emission. So in order to reduce the GHG emission, then on one hand, of course, energy transition is important, but also as important is to transition to a circular economy where there is greater efficiency and circularity of resource usage. Now, for the circular economy, starting from the resource usage or the circular economy, so starting from the use of raw materials all the way to the recycle or reuse of materials. So there is the linkage between the different steps in the production and the raw materials all the way to the recycling. So it is important that we strengthen the linkages between the different steps. And also what is the most important in this process is for the stakeholders, for example, the industries and the NGOs or the consumers, local governments, the central government. So we need to have the engagement of all the stakeholders as well as very strong participation. And what is also more important is that we need to build the kind of consensus on the need for the circular economy so that we will be able to usher in the kind of transition toward the circular economy that we need to move toward carbon neutrality. Now, in the future, before the waste is generated, so this means that we have to focus more on the production and the consumption stage before the waste is generated, so that we will be able to reduce waste to begin with. And also, in order to do that, we have to strengthen the eco-design as well as green consumption patterns. And also for this, we need such tools as technological innovation, financial investment, green finance, green infrastructure, standards and certification, and also incentives to encourage participation by the producers as well as the consumers. And we also need to have the kind of data management platform to take an overlook into the overall material flow. And also it is important to improve the process to reduce the resource input and also to minimize the generation of inventory. And in order to do this, we need to have stronger communication with the consumers, and we also need to improve the product structure as well as the materials so they will be able to lengthen the product life cycle. And also in terms of the purchase and use of the recycled materials, the producers also have the power to make that kind of decision. So we see that the producers in the circular economy have a very important role to play. And then down the road, we also need to provide the kind of institutional design to motivate the industry and the producers, meaning that we also need to provide them with the kind of R&D research necessary to develop this kind of recyclable materials, and we also need to broaden the green infrastructure. And also the government has announced the goal to promote circular economy in Korea along with the 2050 carbon neutrality implementation strategy. So I would say that this has reflected the government's commitment and will to move toward carbon neutrality. And now as a follow-up action to this, the circular economy innovation roadmap is going to be announced by the end of this year. So along with this, we are currently studying the circular economy policy roadmap, and we are working together with the line ministry, such as the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Industry and Commerce, so that we can elicit the participation by the stakeholders of the circular economy, including the industries as well as the NGOs. So we are currently working on the draft roadmap together with the different subcommittees for the circular economy. So the different support systems to promote circular economy, and also for some of the resource-intensive materials and sectors like plastic and batteries. So we are looking into these different sectors and batteries. So for total 8 subcommittees looking into 25 detailed topics regarding this roadmap. So for example, the development and commercialization of recycled materials, and also the resource circulating design to reduce the resource input from the beginning, and also the upcycling, but not only that, the recovery and reuse of waste resources, and all the way to establishing the statistical basis for the recycling activities, and also supporting green finance and creating circular system in certain space. So we are looking into different options and different tools to move towards circular economy. And we are also going to come up with some monitoring indicators to evaluate and assess our status of moving toward the circular economy. And also by transitioning to the circular economy, we intend to strengthen the linkage between the downstream and the upstream industries. And we also need to create more business models so that we can continue to strengthen the competitiveness of the green industries in Korea. And in the end, we need to replace the natural resources with more recyclable materials so that we will be able to contribute to the 2050 carbon neutrality. Thank you very much.
Okay, many thanks to both of our panelists for the reflections on the climate risk that we're actually facing, but then also the innovative solutions that can come from a system-wide approach through circular economy. We're going to extend by 10 minutes just so that we do have an opportunity to engage with our speakers on some of the really insightful questions that have been submitted by the audience as part of the process for this conference. So in saying that, I would really ask the speakers to keep their responses brief. And I would like to start with Mr. Stefano De Clara. We saw you presented to us a lot of trends that have been taking place across different aspects of the carbon market. One thing that our audience is interested in is the voluntary carbon market. So what role do you see this market playing in the transition to net zero?
Yeah, thanks. And it's an excellent question. So you're right. Most of my presentation talked about the compliance market and the regulatory policies such as carbon pricing, and the voluntary market is the other side of the coin. And by being voluntary in nature, it was really created as a complement to compliance action, especially in the Kyoto Protocol days, where you had countries with commitments and countries without commitments. And to a large extent, the voluntary market generated reductions in areas that were not covered by a commitment. Now that we're moving into the Paris Agreement era, where every single country will have a commitment, the voluntary market will obviously have to change in nature in a way, and it will have to interact more and more with compliance markets as well. And there is an ongoing discussion on what that will look like exactly. But it's important to keep in mind that the current commitments are not taking us far enough to actually meet the long-term goals. And so the voluntary market can really be a key complement to compliance and mandatory action in closing the gap.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Stefano, for that concise and great answer. So changing gears back to the mandatory carbon markets, Mr. Alistair Ritchie, we know that in about 6 weeks' time, the European Commission will come forward with their proposal for a carbon border adjustment. What sort of impact might this instrument have for jurisdictions like the UK and also like Korea that are also pursuing ambitious net zero pathways?
Yeah, thank you, William, for that question. So, as you say, we're expecting some details from the European Commission on this policy. I guess the implications of this will depend on the detailed design that comes out, but clearly the EU is looking to protect against the risk of carbon leakage of its industry. So this is a kind of a byproduct of the EU's GHG reduction targets and the expectation that the carbon price in the EU will rise significantly, auctioning will scale up significantly, and maybe even free allocation won't be there anymore. So I think that the EU is obviously looking to try and protect its industrial competitiveness internationally, and will be seeking, I guess, equivalency in terms of carbon price levels or ambition of ETS cap setting, other elements. So I think the impact of this is going to be to drive the level of ambition of ETS. It's going to drive ETS to be based on absolute cap, absolute and declining cap, not output-based targets, which is like the current China system. It would just generally raise those ambitions, and obviously we need to see what the impacts are. But I think that it's realistic, given how many developing countries are already developing carbon pricing policies, like Indonesia, Vietnam, and other countries. So I think it's realistic that there is a global increase in ambition, and CBAM will be a key driver for that.
Many thanks, Alistair, and I think you're right. It's hard to know before we see the details of the proposal. So all eyes will be on the Fit for 55 package that we expect in mid-July. So now turning to Ms. Min Lee, and I should have also mentioned China as part of that group of countries that are sort of pushing forward with ambitious net zero policies. And I would like to get an understanding from yourself as to what is the expected role of the Chinese national emissions trading system in really driving the ambitious agenda that China has that you presented to us this morning.
Thank you, William. Yeah, I think we could clearly seeing the national ETS, our national carbon market, has already set an example for how the market-oriented mechanism could to have the largest involvement from the public, and also it's a bottom-up, not top-down approach to have things really addressed and also have issues and challenges solved. Also, it has a reference back to our CDM experiences, thanks to the global actions and global compact on addressing climate change issues, which has also already give a very good beginning how we can use to convince the public to support the national carbon market, and to really scale it up and to increase as many sectors as possible in the shortest time. Although we have only like the first covered sectors, power sector, only 2,200 entities, but it is already 4 billion tons CO2 emissions, and that is a huge amount. And hopefully by end of 2025, the end of 13th five-year plan, 14th, yes, we have more than 3 or 4 sectors, or hopefully we'll have more like the top 8 sectors, or prioritized 8 sectors will be fully included into the national carbon market. And that is definitely a very good promise to moving forward to achieve the peak of CO2 emission earlier than 2030. So that if we can achieve that, we can do more by end of 2025. It gain time for the whole country, and also gain time for mankind. I think I stop here.
Thank you, Ms. Min Lee. And yes, it's really exciting to see the developments that are taking place in China. And I think this also is creating a lot of learnings for jurisdictions in the region. So I would now like to move to our final speaker, Professor Sung-Yik Kyu. And the question that has been posed from our audience today is, what role do we expect for carbon offsets or carbon credits in the Korean emissions trading system, I guess both in the short term and over the longer term as we move towards the net zero target?
Yeah, so that was a question about carbon offset. So Korea has the emissions target, and part of those targets will be met through overseas offset by 2030. And within the ETS, out of the emissions submitted by businesses, 5% will be allowed for overseas offset. But in order to achieve the 2050 goal, are we going to continue with the overseas offset? I think we have to think about this issue from different perspectives. In order to achieve net zero by 2050, one of those goals, should we rely on overseas markets for those goals, is a fundamental question that we have to ask. So was it ICAP? We heard from the ICAP's presentation that in terms of costs, so we're talking about the current costs. So in terms of current costs, it may be more cost-effective to buy emissions from overseas markets. Theoretically speaking, yes. But cheap emissions permits, if they are introduced to a specific country, would that country make a lot of efforts to meet their targets and develop relevant technology, advanced technologies? That is an important question. And the offset credits that are imported may not be of good quality. So what we have to do is, as Dr. Alice Dare also said, what we have to do going forward is to achieve a certain level of emissions targets so that we can further talk about the offsets being traded. So I believe that this would be the right path for many countries to follow. And if you look at Article 6 of Paris Agreement, it stipulates that we have to contribute to enhance the sustainable development of the host country. So we also have to think about how to promote and cooperate in terms of supporting the growth of the host country. So in the long run, we really have to have in-depth discussions and researches in that regard.
Thank you very much, Professor Song-Yuk. And so I would like you all to join me in thanking all of our speakers and also panelists in what was a really inspiring session to show just what is going on in different regions or different countries around the world as we start increasing our actions towards these net zero targets. So thank you very much. And with that, I would like to pass back to our fantastic MC for the day.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the fantastic discussion and also for leading the session. Well, yes, through the session too, we have been discussing regarding the preparation for carbon neutrality by 2050. So once again, everyone who have joined us on site and also online, thank you very much for the productive discussion. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this was indeed a great opportunity for all of us to once again pledge to fulfill our promises and assist the ongoing efforts. And unfortunately, we have reached to the end of the conference. Well, thank you everyone for the participation, and all the presentation materials and the recorded videos of today's conference will be found on our official website, igckorea.kr. So ladies and gentlemen, with that, we conclude low emission development to achieve carbon neutrality and SDG, the 12th International Greenhouse Conference. Well, with that, until next time, goodbye.